The morning light came in pale and deliberate through the tall courtroom windows, stretching itself across polished wood floors and the heavy mahogany bench. Like something searching for warmth and finding none, Judge Naomi Carter sat motionless behind that bench, her posture as precise as the rulings that had built her reputation over the past decade. At 41, she had become a quiet legend in family court, the judge who could hear the worst stories of neglect, violence, abandonment, and never once let her voice shake. Attorneys trusted her to be fair, social workers trusted her to be efficient, foster agencies trusted her to be decisive. Everyone trusted her not to feel. There had been whispers early on in her appointment that she was too detached, that the job required empathy as much as intellect. But those whispers had died quickly beneath the weight of her results. Children placed safely, reunifications granted only when stable, abusive guardians stripped of custody without hesitation. Naomi Carter did not cry in her courtroom. She did not comfort. She assessed, she ruled, and she moved on. Unbreakable, they called her. No one in courtroom 214 knew that 9 years ago, Naomi had lain in a hospital bed just 3 miles away, staring at fluorescent ceiling lights while a nurse with sympathetic eyes told her that her son had not survived the emergency delivery. They had used words like complications and distress, and we did everything we could. Someone had placed papers in her trembling hands while she was still groggy from anesthesia, guiding her through signatures she could barely see. They had advised her gently that seeing the body might be too traumatic. She had nodded because she did not have the strength to argue. She had never held him. The memory lived in a locked place now, buried beneath legal briefs and years of disciplined restraint. Most days, it stayed there. Most days. Naomi lowered her gaze to the case file in front of her, its thickness immediately out of proportion. With the age listed on the tab, read, Malik age, 8 current placement, Turner. James and Patricia petition, immediate placement termination 6 placements in 8 years. Her eyes moved down the page automatically, absorbing the familiar language that so often accompanied children like this one. Night terrors, aggressive episodes, failure to bond, selective mutism. The clinical phrasing made everything sound manageable, contained, symptoms instead of suffering. Naomi turned the page with steady fingers, her mind already calculating possible alternatives if the placement was dissolved today: group home availability, emergency foster beds, temporary therapeutic placements. The courtroom doors opened quietly. Naomi's attention lifted as the social worker entered, guiding a small boy toward the front bench reserved for children awaiting placement hearings. Malik Reed moved with a kind of careful stillness that immediately set him apart from the usual restless energy of 8-year-olds. He didn't drag his feet or swing his arms or glance curiously around the room, the way most children did. Instead, he walked as though the floor beneath him might give way if he stepped too hard. His navy sweater hung loose across narrow shoulders, sleeves pushed halfway up his forearms. His shoes were scuffed at the toes, but it wasn't his clothes that held Naomi's attention. It was the way he held the photograph, both hands wrapped around it, fingers curled tight along its worn edges, like it was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath him. The corners of the paper were bent from being handled too often, its surface softened with time. Even from the bench, Naomi could see the faint crease running through its center where it had been folded and unfolded. Again and again, he didn't look at the Turners as they took their seats beside their attorney. He didn't look at the social worker when she murmured something softly to him. He looked at the floor, and he hummed. It was barely audible at first, little more than a vibration carried in the quiet spaces between shuffling papers and whispered conversations, a low, steady rhythm, not quite a melody, more like a pattern. Naomi might have missed it entirely if the courtroom hadn't fallen into that familiar anticipatory silence that always came before proceedings began. Her pen paused against the margin of the case file. There it was again, soft, repetitive, almost soothing. The sound made something tighten unexpectedly in her chest. Naomi lifted her eyes toward the boy. Malik Reed sat perfectly still, gaze fixed downward, lips barely moving as that faint hum slipped out between them. It wasn't the aimless noise of boredom or distraction. There was structure to it, intent, as though he were following something only he could hear. Something about the rhythm unsettled her in a way she couldn't immediately explain. On the opposite side of the aisle, Patricia Turner leaned toward her attorney, her voice carrying just enough to reach the bench. "We've done everything we can," she said, exhaustion and irritation threaded carefully through her tone. "But the night terrors are getting worse. And the aggression. Last week he lashed out at my husband when we tried to wake him from a nightmare." Naomi's gaze remained on Malik. He hadn't reacted to the word aggression. He hadn't reacted at all. He just kept humming. The hum did not stop when the proceedings began. It threaded its way beneath the formal cadence of legal language, slipping quietly between objections and clarifications, hiding in the soft scrape of chairs and the rustle of documents. Naomi tried, at first, to ignore it the way she ignored most extraneous noise in her courtroom: the coughs, the nervous tapping of shoes, the whispered consultations between attorneys. But this was different. It was measured, intentional, a pattern, repeated over and over with the kind of quiet precision that suggested it wasn't meant to be heard by anyone else. Or perhaps it was meant to be heard by only one person. Naomi forced her attention back to the matter at hand as the Turners' attorney rose, smoothing the front of his suit with practiced composure. "Your Honor, my clients regret that we have reached this point, but Malik's behavioral issues have escalated beyond what their home environment can safely manage." Behavioral issues. The phrase landed with the sterile weight of documentation, stripping context from everything it described. Naomi had heard it hundreds of times before. It usually meant a child who didn't trust easily, a child who hoarded food or woke up screaming or flinched when someone moved too fast. It meant damage that had been misinterpreted as defiance. Behind the attorney, Patricia Turner's lips pressed into a sympathetic line that didn't reach her eyes. "He doesn't sleep," she added when prompted. "He screams at night, not just crying, screaming like someone's hurting him. And when we try to help, he lashes out. Last Tuesday, he tried to bite James when we went into his room." Naomi's gaze flicked toward Malik again. No reaction. He sat with his shoulders slightly hunched forward, the photograph still trapped in both hands. His fingers moved now, rubbing the edge of the paper in a slow, repetitive motion that might have been unconscious if not for the tension visible in his knuckles. And still, that hum. Low, soft, persistent. "He refuses to participate in family activities," James Turner continued. "Won't speak to us, won't speak to the therapist, won't speak at school. The doctors believe it's selective mutism." Selective. As if silence were a choice, Naomi's pen moved across the margin of the file, though she wasn't sure what she was writing anymore. Something about the sound was working its way under her skin, slipping past the professional armor she'd spent years constructing piece by careful piece. She'd built that armor deliberately, layer by layer, after the hospital. After the fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell and the doctor who wouldn't meet her eyes when he said the word stillborn. After the nurse who had rested a hand on her arm and gently insisted that seeing the baby would only make things worse. After the quiet cremation handled internally so she wouldn't have to endure the trauma of a funeral. Naomi had accepted it because grief had hollowed her out. Until compliance was easier than questions. Her pen stopped moving. Malik's hum shifted slightly, rising and falling in a pattern that made something in the back of her mind stir. Not quite recognition, not quite memory, just a pressure behind her ribs, like the faint echo of a dream she couldn't fully recall. "Your Honor?" She blinked, realizing the attorney had stopped speaking. "Yes," Naomi said, her voice steady. The social worker cleared her throat. "If the placement is terminated today, Malik will need to be returned to group care until another foster home can be identified." Group care. The effect was immediate. Malik's shoulders went rigid. His fingers tightened around the photograph until the paper bowed inward under the pressure. The hum faltered for the first time since he'd entered the room, catching in his throat like a breath held too long. Naomi saw it, the precise moment the word landed. Fear didn't show itself the way people expected in children like Malik. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't always come with tears. Sometimes it was this: stillness so absolute it looked like absence. A child shrinking into himself as though trying to disappear entirely. The hum started again. Faster now, not soothing anymore, urgent. Naomi leaned forward almost without realizing she was doing it, her hands folding together on the bench. From this angle, she could see the edge of the photograph more clearly, the faint outline of an image worn thin by time. "Malik," she said gently, her voice cutting through the procedural monotony that had filled the room. The attorney's words died mid-sentence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Malik's humming stopped altogether. His head lifted slowly, like the movement required effort. Dark eyes met hers for the first time, and something in Naomi's chest tightened so sharply it stole her breath. Children looked at judges all the time, pleading, defiant, confused. This wasn't any of those things. This was recognition. He studied her face with a quiet intensity that felt wildly out of place in an 8-year-old, his grip on the photograph loosening just enough for it to slip from his hands. It fluttered to the floor between them. No one moved to retrieve it. Naomi was suddenly, irrationally aware of the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and uneven in the silence that followed. The courtroom seemed to hold itself still, waiting for something none of them could name. Malik pushed himself to his feet. The social worker reached for him instinctively, but he stepped out of her grasp without looking away from Naomi. When he spoke, his voice was small, but it carried, clear, certain. "You found me." Naomi didn't realize she had stood up until the bailiff shifted beside the courtroom doors, his hand hovering uncertainly near the handle as if waiting for instruction that hadn't come. The words still seemed to be suspended in the air between them. "You found me. Not help me. Not don't send me back. Not even please." There was no desperation in Malik's voice, no bargaining, no fear, just certainty. Every instinct honed by 15 years in the legal system told Naomi what should happen next. The child was distressed. The situation was emotionally charged. Proceedings should be paused. The social worker should intervene. The attorney should request a recess. Protocol would carry them all safely back into the predictable machinery of process. But no one moved. The silence stretched, brittle and electric, until even the Turners seemed unsure whether they should be offended or afraid. Naomi's gaze dropped, involuntarily, to the photograph lying face down on the courtroom floor. She had reviewed thousands of exhibits in this room, evidence of neglect, medical records documenting abuse, grainy surveillance stills of custody exchanges that had gone wrong, objects that proved one truth or another. But something about the way this single sheet of paper had landed, halfway between the bench and the boy, made it feel less like evidence and more like an accusation. "Malik," the social worker whispered, reaching again for his arm. "Sweetheart, let's sit down." He didn't seem to hear her. He was still looking at Naomi, his breathing shallow now, chest rising and falling in small, controlled movements that spoke of effort rather than calm. And then he started humming. Again, the sound came softer this time, barely there, like something remembered instead of performed. A rhythm built from repetition rather than melody. Naomi felt it before she fully registered it, a low vibration threading through her awareness, slipping beneath language and logic alike. Something inside her recoiled. No, not recoiled, recognized. Her fingers tightened against the edge of the bench as the hum curved upward in a way that made the back of her throat ache with an emotion she couldn't name. A sound without context should not have carried this kind of weight. It should not have felt familiar in the way a half-forgotten scent or a childhood lullaby might feel familiar. Present and absent all at once, her mind disciplined and orderly. Search for explanation. There wasn't one. "Your Honor," the Turner's attorney said carefully, his voice cutting into the moment with professional neutrality. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess." Naomi didn't answer. Her attention had drifted again to the photograph. It lay where it had fallen, edges curled slightly from age. One corner bent inward, revealing the faintest glimpse of white beneath the gloss, a border, as though it had been printed long ago. Handled often. Loved, even. She became aware distantly that Malik had stopped humming once more, that he was watching her with that same unwavering focus that made it feel as though he were waiting for something specific. Not from the courtroom, not from the social worker, but from her alone. Naomi stepped down from the bench. The movement broke whatever spell had held the room in place. The bailiff shifted. The attorney opened his mouth to object. Patricia Turner made a small, startled sound as Naomi's heels clicked softly against the floor, closing the distance between herself and the child whose case she had been prepared to process like any other. But it wasn't like any other. It couldn't be. She bent, slowly, and picked up the photograph. The paper was warm from where Malik's hands had held it. For a moment, she considered returning it without looking, maintaining distance, preserving the professional barrier that had kept her safe for nearly a decade. Instead, she turned it over. The image struck her with such force that the courtroom seemed to tilt beneath her feet. A hospital corridor, fluorescent lights, a younger version of herself, hair pulled back, face pale and drawn with exhaustion, walking beside a man in scrubs toward the maternity wing. One hand rested protectively against the curve of her swollen belly. Her wedding band caught the light. Naomi's breath left her in a sound that wasn't quite a gasp. She knew this photograph, not because she remembered taking it, but because she remembered the day before everything went wrong, the day before alarms had sounded and nurses had rushed in, and the world had narrowed to the sterile brightness of an operating room ceiling. The day before they told her her son hadn't survived. Her thumb moved, without permission, to the back of the photograph. There was writing there, faded ink pressed into paper worn thin by time. Two words, your mother. The courtroom blurred at the edges. Naomi became aware dimly that someone was speaking, that the attorney had risen again, that the social worker had moved closer to Malik, as though preparing to remove him from a situation that no longer fit the boundaries of any normal proceeding. But Malik wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Naomi. Waiting. As though the most important part hadn't happened yet. And then he spoke again. You used to sing to me, he said quietly. Naomi's hand began to tremble. In the dark, Malik added, before I was born, the words did not make sense. They couldn't. Naomi's first instinct was to reject them outright, to place them neatly into the category of trauma response, confabulation, emotional displacement. Children in the system built stories all the time. They attached significance where none existed. They invented memories because invented memories were safer than empty spaces. That was what she should have believed. That was what she would have ruled had this been anyone else's courtroom. But her hand was still trembling around the photograph, and the sound of Malik's voice had reached into a place she had locked away. With surgical precision 9 years ago, you used to sing to me, he repeated, softer this time, like he was afraid she hadn't heard him. Or worse, afraid she had. A muscle in Naomi's jaw tightened. That's not possible, she said automatically. The words came out too quickly, too sharp. Malik didn't flinch. He didn't look confused or embarrassed the way children usually did when corrected by authority. If anything, his small face seemed to settle into something steadier, a kind of patient sadness that made Naomi's chest ache for reasons she couldn't name. It was the one that went like. He hesitated, brow furrowing slightly in concentration, like the rain on the window. The courtroom felt suddenly smaller. Naomi was aware, painfully aware, of the Turners watching from their seats, of the attorney shifting beside them, of the bailiff hovering near the door, uncertain whether to intervene or simply bear witness to whatever this was becoming. Protocol demanded she end this, call recess, remove the child, restore order. Instead, she found herself saying, "What?" Song. Malik's gaze dropped to the floor for the briefest moment, as if searching for courage there. When he looked up again, his lips parted, and the hum returned. Not the urgent rhythm from before. This was slower. Softer. A melody now, unmistakable in its shape. Naomi's breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. No one else in the room reacted at first. To them, it was likely just a child's aimless tune, the kind picked up from television jingles or playground rhymes. But Naomi knew better, because she had made it up, alone in her apartment during the long months of her pregnancy when sleep came in shallow bursts and anxiety curled tight in her chest. She had sung it into the quiet darkness, hands resting over the steady swell of her belly, imagining the son she would meet in a few short weeks. No lyrics, Just a rhythm meant to soothe. She had never written it down, never sung it for anyone else, never heard it again after the hospital, until now. The photograph slipped from her fingers. This time, it was the bailiff who bent to retrieve it. His movements careful, uncertain, but Naomi didn't see him. Her attention had narrowed to the small boy standing a few feet away, humming something he should not have known. Something he could not have known, unless, no, her mind rejected the thought before it could fully form. There had been a body, there had been paperwork, a death certificate signed by the attending physician and co-signed by hospital administration. She had reviewed it herself months later, when grief turned to disbelief and disbelief turned to anger. She remembered the weight of the document in her hands, the official seal embossed in the corner. She remembered the nurse who wouldn't meet her eyes when she asked to see her son one last time. Naomi's stomach twisted. "Your Honor," the attorney said again, more urgently now. "This is highly inappropriate. The child is clearly distressed." "I'm not distressed," Malik said quietly. The interruption was so unexpected that the attorney stopped mid-sentence. Malik took a step forward, then another. The social worker reached for him instinctively, but something in his posture, the strange, fragile determination of it, made her hand falter in midair. Naomi became aware of her own heartbeat, loud and uneven in her ears. "You were crying," Malik continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "when they took me away." The world seemed to tilt sideways. A murmur ran through the courtroom, soft, unsettled, but Naomi couldn't process it, couldn't process anything except the sudden, vivid image rising unbidden in her mind. A recovery room, the antiseptic smell of disinfectant, her own voice hoarse from screaming questions no one would answer. "Where's my baby?" The memory struck with the force of impact. She had been crying, begging, demanding to see him. But the nurse, what had her name been? Had only shaken her head gently, saying it was better this way. That some things were too painful to look at. That closure didn't always require sight. Malik's next words came like a confession. "The lady in the blue scrubs said you weren't supposed to wake up yet." Naomi's knees nearly gave out. He couldn't know that. There was no way he could know that. And yet, he was still looking at her with that same unwavering certainty, as though he had been waiting 8 years for her to understand something he had always known. The first thing Naomi became aware of was the sound of someone breathing too fast. It took her a moment to realize it was her. The courtroom had dissolved into fragments, shapes without meaning, voices without language, but Malik remained sharply in focus, standing just beyond the reach of her outstretched certainty. The world had narrowed to the space between them, to the impossible suggestion hanging in the air like something alive. "The lady in the blue scrubs said you weren't supposed to wake up yet." The sentence replayed itself over and over, threading through memories Naomi had spent 9 years convincing herself were grief-distorted hallucinations. Because there had been a moment, one she had never told anyone about. Not her therapist, not the hospital review board, not even herself, in the quiet hours when sleep refused to come. A flicker of awareness beneath the anesthesia. The world reduced to muffled voices and pressure behind her ribs, a sense, brief and irrational, that someone else was in the room who wasn't supposed to be there, and a voice low female irritated. "She's coming around too soon." Naomi's hand gripped the edge of the bench to steady herself. She had dismissed it later as the mind's attempt to build coherence from trauma, a dream, maybe, a misfiring neuron trying to make sense of surgical noise and morphine haze. But Malik was watching her now with the kind of solemn patience that did not belong to children. "They thought you couldn't hear," he added softly. The room erupted, not loudly, not at first, but with the subtle breakdown of order that precedes chaos. The Turners began speaking all at once, Patricia's voice sharp with disbelief, while James demanded this nonsense. Be stopped immediately. The attorney moved forward, his objection half-formed as he gestured toward the social worker. "This is exactly what we've been dealing with," he insisted. "Fabrication, confusion. The child has a documented history of dissociative episodes." Malik didn't look at him. He didn't look at anyone except Naomi. "They put me in a box," he said. The words landed wrong to flat to simple. Naomi felt her stomach twist violently as her mind tried, and failed to assign context. A box? She heard herself repeat. He nodded once. Clear, he said, with holes on the side so I could breathe. Somewhere to her left, someone made a choking sound. Naomi's vision tuned. Incubators. The neonatal unit had been just down the hall from recovery. She remembered passing it weeks earlier during a prenatal checkup. Rows of transparent bassinets lined beneath fluorescent lights, each one holding a life so new it barely understood its own existence. They said I was quiet. Malik continued, his voice growing steadier now that the words had begun to come, that I didn't cry enough. A ripple of disbelief moved through the courtroom. Naomi's mind supplied an image she had never seen but suddenly could not escape. A newborn child placed somewhere he did not belong. Watched. Assessed. Evaluated not as a patient, but as a product. I heard you, Malik said. Her throat tightened painfully. Heard me what? Sing. The word barely made it out. Malik's gaze flicked, just for a second, toward the photograph still clutched in the bailiff's uncertain hands. You kept doing it even when the machines were beeping, he said. Even when the doctor told you to stop. Naomi felt something inside her fracture, because she had. In the operating room, when fear had swallowed reason and pain had blurred into terror, she had done the only thing she could think of to keep herself from falling apart. She had sung. Not loudly, the mask over her face made sure of that, but enough to feel the vibration of it in her chest, enough to convince herself that her son might somehow recognize the sound. If everything else went wrong, if he never saw her face, if she never got to hold him, the melody rose in her mind now, unbidden and unstoppable, the same one Malik had hummed. You're supposed to be dead, Patricia Turner snapped suddenly, her voice breaking through the suspended horror. This is insane. He's making it up. Mrs. Turner. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The words cut cleanly through the rising panic, sharp with an authority that had nothing to do with her title, and everything to do with the tremor running through her bones. Patricia fell silent. Naomi forced herself to look at Malik again. Really look. Not as a case file, not as a placement problem, not as a child whose trauma needed to be categorized and managed, but as a boy, 8 years old, black curls cropped close to his head, shoulders still rounded inward like he expected impact at any moment, fingers that had learned too early to cling to something solid because nothing else ever stayed. Her gaze moved involuntarily to the curve of his cheek, the line of his jaw, the faint crease that appeared between his brows when he concentrated, features she had seen before, not in a mirror, but in someone else, someone she had never been allowed to meet. Her son would have been 9 now. Malik shifted his weight slightly, as though preparing himself for something difficult. They told me not to remember, he said. The words were so quiet Naomi almost missed them, said it would just make you sad. A chill moved through her, slow and deliberate. Who told you that? She asked. Malik hesitated. For the first time since he had spoken, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then, the man with the gold watch, the attorney, froze, because seated at the prosecution's table, adjusting his cufflink with a hand that had suddenly gone very still, was a man wearing one. Asterisk. For a moment, no one in the courtroom seemed to understand what had just happened. It wasn't dramatic, not in the way television had taught them to expect drama. No shouted accusation, no finger-pointing with theatrical certainty, just a child's voice. The man with the gold watch. Naomi followed Malik's line of sight automatically, across the aisle, seated with the quiet confidence of someone who had appeared in this courtroom hundreds of times without incident. Assistant County Counsel Robert Gaines lowered his hand, slowly from where it had been adjusting the cuff of his shirt. The gold watch on his wrist caught the morning light. A subtle gleam, nothing more. Except Naomi had known Robert Gaines. For nearly 6 years, he was meticulous, professional, impeccably prepared in every case involving adoption oversight or foster placement review. When agencies needed fast-tracked approvals or emergency hearings pushed through procedural bottlenecks, he was often the one sent to facilitate. He had testified before her bench more times than she could count, always with documentation in perfect order. Always calm, always reasonable, and always wearing that watch. It was an old habit, one she had noticed in passing but never examined, the way he would turn the bezel with his thumb while listening to testimony, a nervous tick, perhaps, or simply something, to occupy his hands during proceedings. But Malik was staring at it now as though it had reached out and touched him. That one, he whispered. The social worker shifted beside him. Malik, sweetheart, you need to. He had it on. In the hospital, Robert Gaines stood. Your Honor, he said, voice even but pitched just slightly higher than usual. With respect, this is becoming highly irregular. The child is clearly experiencing a dissociative episode. I strongly recommend. You were in the maternity ward, Malik said. The words weren't loud, but they carried. Gaines stopped speaking. Naomi became aware of the sudden silence that had swallowed the room. Even the Turners had gone quiet now, their earlier indignation replaced with something sharper, something that looked almost like fear. That's impossible, Gaines replied after a beat. I have never. You dropped your pen. The interruption came without hesitation. Naomi's pulse thudded painfully against her ribs. You were talking to the doctor, Malik continued, eyes never leaving the gold watch, and it rolled under the chair. You said you didn't want to touch the floor because it was, he frowned slightly, searching for the word, contaminated. The attorney's mouth opened, closed. Naomi watched a bead of sweat form along Gaines's temple. It slid slowly downward. That's absurd, he said, but the certainty had gone from his voice now, replaced with something brittle and thin. I wasn't even working for the county 9 years ago. You said my name. Every muscle in Naomi's body locked. Malik's hands had begun to tremble, but he didn't look away. You said it was a good name, he whispered. Benjamin. The courtroom detonated. Voices rose in overlapping confusion, objections, protests. The scrape of chairs against polished wood. The Turners were speaking again. Patricia's tone sharp with alarm as she demanded this line of questioning be stopped immediately. Naomi didn't hear any of it. Benjamin. The name hit her like a physical blow. No one in this room knew that name. She had chosen it in secret during the second trimester, writing it once in the back of a legal pad and then tearing the page out. Before anyone else could see, she had never told her colleagues, hadn't even told the hospital staff when they asked if she had decided yet. It had been hers alone, a promise made in quiet moments when the future still felt certain. Her son's name. I want a recess, Gaines said sharply now, his composure fracturing at the edges. Immediately, Naomi didn't respond. Her gaze had shifted back to Malik, to the way his breathing had quickened, chest rising and falling to fast beneath the loose navy sweater, to the faint sheen of sweat across his brow, as though speaking these memories cost him something tangible. They said it would be easier if you never saw me, he went on, voice beginning to shake, that you'd stop asking questions if there was nothing to look at. Naomi's stomach lurched. A nurse with sympathetic eyes. It would only make things worse. Closure doesn't always require sight. You signed the paper, Malik said, tears spilling over now without his permission, because you thought I was already gone. Her knees buckled. This time, she didn't manage to stay upright. The bench caught her on the way down, would striking her hip hard enough to bruise, but she barely felt it. The courtroom spun wildly at the edges as memories she had buried beneath 9 years of discipline came roaring back with terrifying clarity. The forms, the cremation authorization, the way the nurse had turned the last page toward her before she could finish reading the first. She pressed a hand against her mouth, fighting the sudden urge to be sick. Across the aisle, Robert Gaines had gone very, very still, because Malik wasn't looking at the watch anymore. He was looking at him, and there was recognition in his eyes, the kind that came from seeing someone once, when you were never supposed to remember them at all. The bailiff was the first to move. Court is in recess, he said automatically, though no one had instructed him to speak. The words broke whatever fragile suspension had been holding the room together. Chairs scraped back. Attorneys leaned into urgent whispers. Patricia Turner began insisting, in a voice pitched to high, to be steady, that this entire proceeding had become dangerously inappropriate. But Naomi didn't rise. She remained where she had caught herself against the bench, one hand braced against its polished surface as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the present. The hum of fluorescent lights above seemed suddenly deafening. Benjamin. Malik had said it like it belonged to him, like it was something he'd carried for years without understanding why. Across the aisle, Robert Gaines reached for his briefcase with deliberate calm. The kind of calm that looked rehearsed when held up against the tremor running through his fingers. He snapped it shut with more force than necessary, the click of metal latches sharp in the unsettled quiet. "I'll be filing a motion for mistrial on this placement hearing," he announced to no one in particular. "This child's psychological state clearly renders. You told them not to let her see me." Gaines froze. The sentence had come out ragged this time, dragged up from somewhere Malik didn't seem to fully control. His small hands were clenched at his sides now, knuckles white against dark skin. Naomi's breath stalled. "That's enough," the social worker said quickly, stepping forward. "Malik, we're going to go wait outside." He said she'd fight it, Malik continued, voice breaking as though each word had weight, that she was the type to keep asking questions. The memory came without warning, not visual. Auditory, a voice filtered through surgical haze, male, impatient, somewhere beyond the bright white curtain of anesthesia that had separated Naomi from everything she loved. She's not the kind who'll just accept it. At the time, she had assumed it was a doctor. Now, Naomi's head snapped toward Gaines. His eyes were no longer on Malik. They were on the door, calculating, measuring the distance. For the first time in 6 years, he looked less like a man confident in procedure and more like someone trying to remember where he had left his exit. "You were standing by the window," Malik said, his gaze narrowing in concentration, next to the lady who kept looking at her watch. Naomi's heart slammed against her ribs. A second voice, female, an administrator, perhaps, or they, were arguing, Malik added, as if piecing it together in real time, about whether the paperwork would hold up if she asked for an autopsy. The courtroom had gone utterly silent. Naomi was dimly aware that someone had begun recording on their phone, that the Turner's attorney had stopped pretending this was about behavioral reports, that the social worker's hand hovered uncertainly near Malik's shoulder, unsure whether removing him would help or make things worse. Because Malik wasn't just remembering now, he was reliving. They said the agency would take care of it, he whispered, that they had a judge already lined up if anything went wrong. Naomi felt the blood drain from her face. A judge. Her mind raced ahead instinctively, cataloging possibilities with the same procedural precision she applied to every case. Who had signed off on the stillbirth review? Who had processed the internal cremation authorization? Who had certified the death certificate without an independent examiner present? The answer rose with nauseating clarity. Family court oversight. Emergency infant fatality certifications were routed through a rotating panel of judicial reviewers, typically assigned without fanfare to avoid backlog. Naomi had never questioned who sat on that panel 9 years ago. Why would she? Her son was dead. The paperwork had been routine. Across the aisle, Gaines took a step backward. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Malik noticed. "You had the watch then too," he said, his voice steadier now that the memory had found shape. It was shiny. Gaines didn't respond. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. Naomi pushed herself upright, ignoring the sharp protest in her hip. The room seemed to tilt, but she forced herself forward anyway. One step, down from the bench, then another. "Mr. Gaines," she said. He didn't meet her eyes. "Were you present in the maternity ward at Riverside Memorial Hospital on May 14th, 9 years ago?" The question was simple, procedural, answerable with a yes or no. But Gaines didn't say either. His hand moved instead, slowly, deliberately, toward the gold watch at his wrist, as if it might somehow still the past if he could just make it stop ticking. The second hand on Robert Gaines's watch moved, one precise tick dot then another. Naomi watched it, because she couldn't seem to look away. In the sudden stillness of the courtroom, that small mechanical motion took on an almost unbearable significance, a reminder that time had continued moving forward for 9 years. while something essential had been stolen from her life and hidden in plain sight. Answer the question, she said. Her voice no longer sounded like it belonged to a judge conducting routine proceedings. It carried something sharper now, something edged with the beginnings of fury. Gaines's jaw flexed. I was present in an administrative capacity, he said finally. The hospital requested legal oversight due to potential liability concerns. Administrative. The word slid neatly into place, dressed in professionalism. Naomi felt something cold settle in her chest. And you participated in the stillbirth review process? That would have been standard protocol. Standard protocol. Malik made a small sound beside her. Not quite a sob, not quite a breath. He told them to hurry, he whispered. Naomi's attention snapped back to him, Gaines's composure. Cracked. It was subtle, a tightening at the corners of his eyes. The briefest flare of something defensive that hadn't been there before. They were waiting for someone, Malik continued. His voice thin with strain now, like a thread stretched. Too far. You kept looking at the door. Naomi's pulse surged. Waiting. For who? She asked before she could stop herself. Malik blinked rapidly, his small hands lifting to press against his temples as though the effort of remembering hurt. A lady, he said after a moment, with red hair. The name came to Naomi instantly, before logic could intervene, before denial could construct something safer. Margaret Ellison. She breathed. The hospital's director of maternal services. 9 years ago, Margaret Ellison had personally signed Naomi's discharge papers, had sat beside her bed with carefully modulated sympathy, explaining that grief was unpredictable, that sometimes it was better not to dwell on the specifics of medical tragedy, that closure could come in many forms. Naomi's vision blurred. They said she had buyers. Malik went on, the words tumbling faster now, like water breaking through a dam, that this one was already promised. The air in the courtroom seemed to vanish. Promised. Her mind supplied the memory she had never understood at the time. Margaret Ellison standing in the doorway of recovery, speaking quietly to someone just out of sight. We can't delay any longer. The words had meant nothing then. Now, they were worried you'd wake up before they finished. Malik said. Finished. Naomi single quotes as stomach lurched violently across the aisle. Gaines had stopped pretending to listen. He was calculating again. Shoulders angled toward the exit, eyes darting once toward the bailiff stationed by the door. It was the look of someone realizing the narrative had slipped beyond his control. You told them the agency had already placed the paperwork, Malik added, that the death certificate could be processed before morning rounds. A murmur swept through the room, shock finding its voice in whispered disbelief. Naomi's knees threatened to give out again. Death certificate. Process. Before morning rounds. That explained the speed. The way everything had been ready when she woke up. The forms printed, the signatures waiting, the quiet efficiency that had carried her from recovery to discharge, without ever allowing her to see what she had lost. Or who. They put me in another room, Malik said, tears spilling freely now. Until the people came. Naomi's breath shuddered. What people? Malik hesitated. For the first time since he began speaking, fear crossed his face in something like recognition. The ones with the ring, he whispered. Naomi frowned. What ring? He swallowed hard. A silver one, he said, with a bird on it. Across the courtroom, someone dropped a pen. The sound was sharp enough to make several heads turn. But Naomi didn't, because she knew that ring, everyone in the county did. It was worn by members of the Family Court Judicial Council, an insignia granted only to sitting judges who had served on the state's adoption review board. Her mind raced backward through memory. 9 years ago, emergency infant, fatality certification, oversight panel assignment. There had been a name on the form, one she had barely registered in her grief, one she trusted without question. Malik's next words came slowly, as though each one had to be pulled from somewhere. Deep, he said not to worry. He murmured that he'd make sure no one ever asked about me again. Naomi's heart slammed painfully against her ribs, because she knew exactly who had signed that form. Judge Daniel Hargrove, the man who had presided over 3 of Malik's foster placement hearings, and who just 2 weeks ago had congratulated her unmaintaining professional distance in emotionally charged cases. The ticking of Gaines's watch suddenly sounded deafening, as though time itself had been keeping count. All along. The name settled into Naomi's mind with the quiet certainty of something that had always been there, waiting for context. Daniel Hargrove, her colleague. Her mentor when she first joined the bench, the man who had walked her through her first termination of parental rights ruling, with patient professionalism, reminding her that emotional distance was the only way to survive in family court, that children needed stability more than sympathy, that grief could not be allowed to compromise judgment. He had signed her son's death certification and 3 of Malik's foster placement transfers. Naomi's hand went cold. Across the courtroom, Robert Gaines shifted again, this time not toward the exit, but toward the counsel's table where his briefcase lay open just enough to reveal the edge of a phone screen lighting up with silent notifications. He wasn't surprised. That was the worst part. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't outraged. He was waiting. Waiting for the same machinery that had buried Naomi's son 9 years ago to engage again now. The procedural choke points, the administrative delays, the quiet reassurances that investigations took time. The system would protect itself. It always had. He smelled like mint, Malik said suddenly. Naomi blinked. What? The judge, he clarified, his voice unsteady with effort. He leaned over me, and I could smell it. Mint. Daniel Hargrove chewed peppermint gum incessantly, a habit so ingrained it had become a joke among the clerks. Naomi had once watched him finish an entire pack during a particularly contentious adoption hearing, the crinkle of foil echoing softly each time he reached for another piece. Malik's hands were shaking now. He told them I'd be placed somewhere safe. He whispered that I'd have a better life if they did it this way. The words scraped raw against Naomi's ribs. Better life. A justification. An equation someone else had solved using her child as the variable. Naomi's gaze snapped back to Gaines. You routed the paperwork through Hargrove, she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. Didn't confirm it either. But the silence carried weight. 9 years of it. The courtroom felt too small now, the air thick with something volatile and waiting. Naomi could hear her own pulse in her ears, could feel the edges of her carefully constructed composure beginning to fracture beneath the pressure of what Malik was saying. They gave me to the lady with the pearls first, Malik continued, his voice thinning as though the memory were pulling him somewhere he didn't want to go. But she brought me back. Naomi's stomach dropped. Brought him back. Returned. Like inventory. They said I cried too much, he added. That I wasn't the baby they paid for. A sound escaped Patricia Turner, sharp and horrified, but Naomi barely registered it, because she understood now. The foster placements, the 6 transfers in 8 years. Malik hadn't entered the system the way other children did, through neglect petitions or emergency removals. He had been cycled through it, laundered, each placement a layer of distance between who he was born as and who he was allowed to become. Her son, Benjamin Carter, had been declared dead on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, Malik Reed had entered the state foster registry with no birth certificate and incomplete medical records. Naomi's vision tunneled. How many? She asked, though she wasn't sure who she was asking anymore. Gaines didn't answer. Malik did. There were other babies, he said quietly. The room tilted. In the room next to mine. Naomi's breath left her in a rush. They had boxes too. Not just him, not just her. A pattern. An operation. They said some moms were easier than others. Malik went on, his voice fading at the edges now. Some didn't have anyone to ask questions for them. Single mothers. Widows. Women without extended family present at delivery. Women who trusted the hospital. Women like Naomi. They said judges were the best, Malik whispered, because no one would think a judge's baby could get stolen. The statement landed like a verdict. Across the aisle, Robert Gaines finally looked at her. And this time, there was no professionalism left in his expression. Only calculation. As if weighing whether what had been said here today was survivable. For him, for Hargrove, for everyone else whose signatures had turned newborn children into paperwork and grief into compliance. Malik swayed. The social worker caught him just before his knees buckled, his small body going suddenly slack with exhaustion. Naomi moved without thinking, closing the distance between them as the courtroom dissolved once more into noise. For the first time in 9 years, she reached for her son, and this time no one could tell her he wasn't alive. Malik's weight was shockingly light in her arms. Naomi hadn't held an 8-year-old child before, not like this, not with his head tipped against her shoulder, and his breath stuttering against the hollow of her throat, like something trying to remember how to exist safely. His fingers still clutched at her robe, bunching the fabric as though it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. For 9 years, she had imagined what it might have felt like to hold her son. She had imagined warmth, weight, the quiet rise and fall of breath against her chest. But she had never imagined it would happen here, in the middle of a courtroom. Built for endings, not beginnings. Get an ambulance, someone was saying. Another voice cut in, sharper, official. No, we need to, don't touch him. Naomi didn't recognize that last voice at first, until she realized it was her own. The room had fractured into motion now. Clerks moving toward the door, the bailiff already on his radio. Patricia Turner crying openly into her husband's shoulder while their attorney whispered urgently into his phone, and Robert Gaines, he was leaving. Naomi saw it out of the corner of her eye, the quiet shift of his chair, the smooth gathering of his briefcase. Not a run, not even a hurried walk, just departure. Like this was another hearing that had reached its natural conclusion. Her blood turned to ice. Stop him, she said. The bailiff hesitated. Stop him. Naomi's voice cracked across the courtroom like a gavel strike. This time, the command landed. 2 uniformed officers moved immediately, blocking Gaines's path before he could reach the double doors. His expression flickered, irritation first, then something closer to concern. You have no grounds, he said evenly. This is. He was in the room, Naomi interrupted. Her voice shook now, but she didn't care. He participated in the falsification of an infant death certificate. He facilitated. That's an extraordinary accusation. My son is alive. Silence swallowed the argument whole. Even Malik stirred faintly at the words, his grip tightening reflexively against her sleeve. Naomi felt it like confirmation. Across the room, Gaines's composure cracked for the first time. Not dramatically, not with anger or protest, but with fear. Because he understood, the same way she did, that this was no longer about placement, hearings or behavioral reports. This was about evidence, paper trails, signatures, the quiet administrative channels that had allowed a newborn child to disappear without question. 9 years ago, they said the judge would fix it, Malik murmured weakly. Naomi bent closer, her hand cradling the back of his head. Which judge? She asked softly. His lashes fluttered. The one with the bird ring. Her stomach dropped. There was no ambiguity left now, no procedural misinterpretation to hide behind. Daniel Hargrove, the man who had presided over Malik's third placement review, the man who had signed Naomi's bereavement certification without ever meeting her eyes, the man who had attended her judicial swearing-in ceremony with a congratulatory handshake and a peppermint smile, the man who a memory surfaced with sickening clarity 3 months ago. A foster placement hearing involving Malik Reed. Hargrove had stepped into the back of the courtroom midway through proceedings, claiming he was there to observe a new caseworker's testimony. Naomi had thought nothing of it at the time. Judges often sat in on each other's hearings for training purposes. He had stayed until the end, long enough to watch Malik escorted out, long enough to make sure. Her vision tunneled. They were going to move me again, Malik whispered. Soon, Naomi's heart slammed against her ribs. Move him where? Another foster home, another state, or somewhere no one would ever connect Malik Reed to Benjamin Carter. Her son hadn't been lost. He had been managed, documented, transferred, through systems designed to protect him from discovery. The photograph, the humming, the memories he wasn't supposed to have. They had all been variables in a calculation someone else had made 9 years ago. A calculation that had almost succeeded. Your Honor, the bailiff said carefully, his voice pulling her back to the present. EMS is on the way. Naomi nodded distantly. Outside, sirens were already beginning to wail, faint at first. then growing louder as they cut through midday traffic toward the courthouse steps. Across the aisle, Robert Gaines had gone very still, because for the first time since Malik began speaking, Naomi was looking at him, not as an officer of the court, but as a witness. And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, the truth was finally starting to breathe.